Imagine you're a French colonist in 1718. You've just crossed the Atlantic Ocean, months at sea. You've survived storms, disease, the constant threat of running out of supplies. You finally reach the coast of what will become Louisiana. And now you need to choose where to build a city, where to establish your colony, where to invest all your resources and labor. You survey the land, and you have options. There are elevated areas. There are locations above sea level with solid ground. There are places along the Mississippi River that would provide the same strategic access to water transportation without the complications. But instead, you choose a swamp. Not just any swamp. A swamp that's below sea level. A swamp where the ground is literally liquid mud. A swamp infested with mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever. A swamp where any heavy structure will sink into the unstable soil. And you decide, yes, this is perfect. Let's build stone cathedrals here. Let's construct massive brick buildings. Let's establish an entire city on ground that won't support the weight. Does that make sense to you? Because it doesn't make sense to me. And the more I researched New Orleans, the more I realized that the official story of its founding has a fundamental problem. The geography is wrong. The timeline is wrong. The technology required is wrong for the period. What if the French colonists didn't build New Orleans? What if they found it? What if there was already a city there, a Tartarian water city like Venice, that had partially sunk or been buried by rising water and mud? What if Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne de Bienville arrived in 1718 and discovered the tops of buildings sticking out of a submerged civilization? And what if everything we're taught about New Orleans is a story designed to hide that truth? Let me show you the evidence. Because once you see it, once you understand what's actually there, New Orleans stops being the charming French quarter city of jazz and beignets. It becomes something else entirely. It becomes America's Atlantis, a sunken Tartarian civilization that we've been walking on top of for 300 years without realizing what's underneath. New Orleans sits in a bowl. That's not metaphorical, it's literal. The city is below sea level. Parts of it are 6 to 20 feet below the level of Lake Pontchartrain to the north and the Mississippi River that curves around it. The entire city is essentially a depression in waterlogged land that wants to be underwater. The official explanation for why the city is below sea level is subsidence. The soil is compacting over time. The weight of buildings pushing down on soft sediment. Natural settling. And yes, that happens. But it doesn't explain why someone would choose to build there in the first place. I spoke with a geotechnical engineer about New Orleans soil conditions. He explained that the ground beneath the city is alluvial deposits. Sediment, deposited by the Mississippi River over thousands of years. It's not solid. It's layers of clay, silt, sand, and organic matter. Waterlogged, unstable. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, "Building anything heavy on this soil without modern deep foundation technology is asking for catastrophic failure. You'd need piles driven 60 to 100 feet down to reach anything resembling stable substrate. And that technology didn't exist in the 1700s. Yet by the 1750s, just 30 years after the supposed founding, New Orleans had substantial masonry structures. The St. Louis Cathedral, originally built in 1727, was a heavy building. Stone, brick, traditional European construction techniques, and according to official history, it was built on soil that modern engineers say cannot support such structures without advanced foundation systems. I found early descriptions of New Orleans written by visitors in the late 1700s. They describe buildings sinking, walls cracking, structures settling unevenly into the mud. But here's what's strange. They describe this as ongoing problems with specific buildings, not as universal catastrophic failure of everything, as if some structures had foundations that worked and others didn't, as if there was existing infrastructure that was solid and new construction that was failing. Benjamin Latrobe, the architect who worked on New Orleans projects in the early 1800s, wrote about foundation techniques he observed. He noted that some of the older buildings in the French Quarter had foundation systems he couldn't fully understand, systems that seemed to work despite the impossible soil conditions. He attributed this to superior French engineering. But what if it wasn't French at all? What if those buildings were standing because they were built by someone else at an earlier time, with technology that Latrobe didn't recognize? The St. Louis Cathedral dominates Jackson Square. It's the iconic image of New Orleans. 3 spires rising above the French Quarter, stone facade, heavy construction, and it sits on ground that, according to modern engineering, shouldn't be able to support it. I found architectural surveys of the cathedral from preservation efforts in the 1900s. Engineers documented the foundation system, and they found something unusual. The original foundations, the ones that date to the earliest construction, go much deeper than they should. They reach depths that would be difficult to achieve with 1700s technology, and the foundation design doesn't match French colonial construction techniques of the period. The cathedral has been rebuilt and modified several times. The current structure dates to 1850, but elements of the original 1727 building remain, and those elements show construction sophistication that seems out of place. A structural engineer I consulted looked at the historical architectural drawings. He pointed out that the load distribution in the original design is more advanced than typical for the period. The way weight is transferred through the structure, the way the foundation spreads the load. It's not wrong. It's just unusually sophisticated for colonial construction in a frontier city. And then there are the other buildings. The French Quarter is full of structures supposedly built in the 17 and 1800s. Substantial brick buildings, 3 and 4 stories, heavy masonry construction, all on the same unstable soil, all somehow standing despite the fact that modern buildings in New Orleans require deep pile foundations driven to bedrock or near bedrock depths. The official explanation is that these old buildings are constantly maintained, constantly repaired, that they settle and crack and need perpetual intervention. And yes, that happens. But they don't catastrophically fail. They don't sink completely into the mud. They stand, as if they're anchored to something deeper, something that was already there. Walk through the French Quarter, and you'll notice something that defines the entire neighborhood. Iron. Intricate ironwork everywhere. On balconies, on windows, on doors, covering entire facades of buildings. They call it iron lace, delicate, beautiful, decorative, except it's not random decoration. It's systematic. Almost every significant building in the French Quarter is covered in iron, and the patterns aren't arbitrary. They're geometric, specific designs that repeat, crosses, stars, spirals, mathematical precision in the spacing and arrangement. I started photographing the iron lace, documenting the patterns, and I noticed something. The ironwork connects from balcony to balcony, from building to building, and it always connects upward, to the roof lines, to the spires, to the highest points of the structures. Iron is a conductor. That's basic physics. And when you cover an entire building in connected iron frameworks, geometrically arranged, all connecting to the highest points, you're creating something specific, a Faraday cage, or an antenna, or both. I found references to electromagnetic disturbances in New Orleans, old newspaper accounts from the 1800s describing strange atmospheric phenomena, lights in the sky during thunderstorms that seemed to concentrate over the French Quarter, reports of compasses acting strangely near certain buildings, watches running fast or slow depending on location in the city. These accounts are dismissed as superstition, voodoo culture, mysticism. But what if they were observing actual electrical phenomena? What if the iron lace wasn't decorative? What if it was functional technology? Part of an atmospheric energy collection system like we've documented in other old world buildings. The style is attributed to Spanish colonial influence. Iron balconies were common in Spain. But the scale is different. The systematic nature is different. In Spain, iron balconies are decorative elements on some buildings. In New Orleans, they're structural systems covering nearly everything built before 1850. And here's the crucial detail. The oldest ironwork, the pieces that date to the earliest periods of the city, show manufacturing sophistication that shouldn't exist. I spoke with a metallurgist who examined samples from preservation projects. He said the iron showed characteristics of advanced casting techniques, alloys that were more sophisticated than typical wrought iron of the period, and manufacturing precision that would be difficult without industrial equipment. His conclusion was that the oldest iron lace must have been imported from Europe, created by master craftsmen using the best techniques available. But what if it wasn't imported? What if it was already there, part of the original city that the colonists found and occupied? New Orleans has a serious water problem. That's not controversial. The city is below sea level, surrounded by water built on a swamp. Water wants to flood the city constantly. So there's an elaborate system of pumps, canals, levees, and drainage infrastructure keeping New Orleans dry. The modern system was largely designed by A. Baldwin Wood in the early 1900s. Wood invented specialized pumps that could move massive amounts of water. His designs are considered engineering marvels. They're still in use today. But here's what the official history glosses over. Wood didn't create the system from scratch. He was improving and mechanizing a system that already existed, a system of canals and drainage that predated his work, a system whose origins are unclear. I found maps of New Orleans from the 1700s. They show an extensive network of canals through the city, not simple drainage ditches, organized waterways, geometric patterns, distribution networks that look more like the canals of Venice than drainage systems of a frontier swamp town. The official story is that these canals were dug by the French colonists to drain the swamp and make the land buildable. But the engineering required to create a functional canal system in ground that's below sea level, surrounded by water on all sides, with the technology of the 1700s, is staggering. You're not just digging ditches, you're creating a system that has to constantly fight water pressure from every direction. I spoke with a hydraulic engineer about this. He explained that creating stable canals in New Orleans soil requires understanding of water pressure, soil mechanics, and structural engineering. The walls of the canals need to be stabilized or they'll collapse. The water flow needs to be controlled or it'll erode everything. And doing this on a citywide scale, with 1700s technology, is barely believable. His assessment was that either the French had engineering knowledge far beyond what we give them credit for, or they were working with infrastructure that was already partially in place, improving and modifying rather than creating from nothing. And then there are the pumping stations. The old wood pumps are massive. Industrial machinery that looks more like something from a Tartarian cityscape than from 1920s American engineering. I visited pump station number 6, which is now a museum. The machinery is beautiful, enormous bronze gears, precision engineering, and power capacity that seems excessive even for modern needs. The tour guide mentioned something interesting. She said that when they did archaeological surveys around the old pump stations, they sometimes found evidence of earlier water management infrastructure, brick channels, stone structures, foundations that predated the 1900s system. But these findings were usually dismissed as failed colonial attempts at drainage, never seriously studied, never properly documented. What if New Orleans wasn't built in a swamp? What if it was a water city? A Tartarian Venice designed to exist in harmony with water rather than constantly fighting it? And what if the canals and waterways we see today are crude reconstructions of a more sophisticated original system? About 30 miles east of New Orleans, sitting in the marshland, there's a structure that shouldn't exist, Fort Pike, built starting in 1819. It's a star fort, perfect geometric precision, 5-pointed bastions forming a star pattern, and it sits in water, literally surrounded by marsh and lake. I went to Fort Pike, stood on the grounds, looked at the foundations, and immediately had questions that the historical markers don't answer. The fort is made of brick, millions of bricks, heavy construction, and it's built on marshy ground that's partially submerged. The official story is that engineers in 1819 designed a foundation system using timber piles driven into the marsh to create a stable platform for the brick construction. But look at the precision. Perfect geometric star, walls that rise uniformly, structures that have stood for over 200 years in an environment that destroys modern construction. The Fort Pike Bridge, which provides vehicle access to the fort, was built in the 1960s. It's already deteriorating, needs constant maintenance, yet the brick fort from 1819 stands solid. Star forts are found worldwide, and they all show the same characteristics: perfect geometry, advanced understanding of defensive architecture, precision engineering, and they're almost always attributed to relatively recent construction despite showing characteristics of much older, more sophisticated building techniques. Fort Pike is officially a defensive fortification built to protect New Orleans from naval attack. But look at the location. It's in a marsh. Ships would have to navigate narrow channels to even reach it. The strategic value is questionable, unless it wasn't built as a fort at all, unless it was already there and the military simply occupied and claimed it. The star fort pattern appears again and again in Tartarian research. These geometric structures that seem to serve purposes beyond simple defense. Some researchers theorize they were part of energy distribution networks, geometric amplifiers, atmospheric energy collectors and redistributors. Fort Pike connects to New Orleans by water, through channels and bayous, part of a network. And if New Orleans was a Tartarian water city, Fort Pike makes more sense as an outpost or node in that civilization's infrastructure, not as a military fort built in 1819, but as a surviving structure from before, found floating in the marsh, occupied, renamed, and credited to American military engineering. In 1884, New Orleans hosted a World's Fair, the World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition. It ran from December 1884 through June 1885. The main building was enormous. Official records state it was 1,378 feet long and 952 feet wide. That's over 33 acres of covered space. It was, at the time, the largest roof structure in the United States, larger than any convention center, larger than any shopping mall, an absolutely massive building, and according to official history, it was built in approximately 1 year. Then, after the fair ended, it was completely demolished, destroyed, removed, all that enormous infrastructure gone. The official explanation is that it was temporary construction, not designed to be permanent, built cheaply with the intention of dismantling it afterward. But I found photographs of the main building. The structure doesn't look temporary. It looks substantial. Brick foundations, steel framework, glass and iron construction. This isn't a tent or a wooden shed. This is industrial architecture. And here's the pattern we've seen before. Chicago, 1893. St. Louis, 1904. Every major American city that hosts a World's Fair builds impossible structures in impossible timeframes, shows them to the public for a few months, and then systematically destroys everything. The common explanation is economic. These buildings were exhibition halls. They served their purpose and weren't needed afterward. Maintaining them would be expensive. Better to demolish and reuse the land. But that explanation falls apart when you look at the details. These weren't simple structures. The engineering required, the materials used, the labor invested, and they just destroy it all, completely, leave nothing standing, unless they had to, unless these World's Fairs weren't showcasing new construction, unless they were excuses to demolish old world architecture that was still standing. Tartarian structures that couldn't be easily explained. So they hold a fair, they modify the buildings slightly, they show them to the public as new construction, and then they tear them down while the demolition is expected and accepted. New Orleans 1884 fits this pattern perfectly. An impossibly large main building, built incredibly fast, destroyed completely afterward. And the location of the fair? City Park, an area that in the 17 and 1800s was described as having unusual structures, ruins, foundations of unknown origin. I found references in old New Orleans Historical Society records to ancient foundations found in City Park during construction projects in the 1800s. These were usually dismissed as Native American structures or very early colonial attempts at building, but they were made of worked stone, showed advanced construction techniques, and were always found deeper than they should be, as if they'd been buried, or as if the ground level had risen, or as if the city had sunk. New Orleans has a unique burial tradition. They don't bury their dead underground. They place them in above-ground tombs, elaborate mausoleums, entire cities of the dead, stone structures that look like miniature houses, lined up in rows like streets. The official explanation is simple. New Orleans is below sea level. The water table is high. If you bury someone in the ground, the coffin will float back up when the ground gets saturated. So above-ground burial became the practical solution. But look at the tombs more closely. They're not simple boxes. They're architectural. They have doors, windows. Some have multiple chambers. They look like houses. Specifically, they look like the houses in the French Quarter, just smaller. Miniature versions of the same architectural style. And here's what made me question the official explanation. The oldest tombs, the ones from the earliest periods of the city's history, are the most elaborate. As time goes on, the tombs get simpler, plainer, less architectural. That's the opposite of what you'd expect. Usually, as a society develops and becomes wealthier, burial customs become more elaborate. But in New Orleans, the oldest graves are the most sophisticated. I found descriptions from early visitors to New Orleans who saw these cemeteries and described them as ruins, not as new construction, as ancient places. That perspective was later dismissed as romantic exaggeration. Visitors seeing exotic French colonial customs and projecting age onto them. But what if those visitors were right? What if these weren't burial places created by the colonists? What if they were the above-ground remains of a city that had sunk? What if these tombs were actually the top floors of buildings that were now buried? And the colonists, finding these small structures sticking up out of the mud, repurposed them as mausoleums. Think about it. If New Orleans sank during a mud flood event, if water and sediment rose rapidly, the tops of single-story buildings would stick up above the new ground level. They'd look like small structures, perfect size for tombs, and they'd already be made of stone or brick, already durable, already there. The colonists wouldn't need to build elaborate above-ground tombs. They'd just need to clean out existing structures, add doors, repurpose what they found. And the story about water table and floating coffins. That becomes the explanation for why they're using these strange above-ground structures instead of normal graves. St. Louis Cemetery, number 1, the oldest cemetery in New Orleans, has some of the most elaborate tombs, and they're positioned in a grid, organized like city streets, as if they were streets, as if this was a neighborhood that sank. And what we see now are the rooftops. I'm not saying I can prove this, but I am saying that once you see the tombs this way, once you imagine them as the surviving tops of submerged buildings, the whole landscape of New Orleans changes. You're not walking through a city built in 1718. You're walking on top of a much older city, a Tartarian water civilization that sank, and everything above the mud line was claimed and repurposed by people who found it and said they built it. Let me connect all of this, because individually, each piece might seem like speculation or alternative interpretation, but together they form a pattern consistent with what we've documented in other investigations. New Orleans is below sea level, not because of gradual subsidence over 300 years, but because it was always a water city, a Tartarian Venice designed to exist in harmony with water, built with advanced hydraulic technology, with foundations that reached stable depths, with water management systems that worked with the environment rather than fighting it. Then something happened, a mud flood, a water catastrophe. The same event we see evidence for worldwide. Water and sediment rose rapidly. The city partially sank. Buildings were buried. The street level rose. And what had been a thriving water city became a partially submerged ruin. When French colonists arrived in 1718, they didn't find empty swampland. They found the tops of buildings sticking out of mud and water. They found a canal system already partially in place. They found infrastructure they didn't understand but could use. So they occupied it, claimed it, said they built it. The iron lace covering every building, that was already there, part of the original city's energy collection system. The colonists saw decorative metalwork and kept it, never knowing it was functional technology. The St. Louis Cathedral and other heavy stone structures. They're standing because they're anchored to foundations from before. Foundations built with technology the colonists couldn't replicate. The colonists added to existing structures, modified them, claimed them as their own construction. But the bases were already there. The elaborate canal system, that predated the colonists. They found it, partially filled with mud. They cleared it, tried to maintain it with their limited technology. Eventually, in the 1900s, A. Baldwin Wood came along and mechanized a system that was already ancient, made it work with pumps and modern engineering. But he was restoring and improving, not creating. Fort Pike and other star forts in the region. They were nodes in the original Tartarian water city network, geometric structures with functions we don't fully understand. The military found them, occupied them, turned them into defensive positions, but didn't build them. The World's Fair of 1884. That was when they needed to destroy the last clearly Tartarian structures. Buildings that were obviously more advanced than anything the colonists could have built. So they held a fair, showed these structures to the public as new construction, as examples of modern American engineering. And then they tore them all down while demolition was expected and accepted. And the cities of the dead. Those are the visible rooftops of the original city, the parts that stuck up above the mud line after the flood, small enough to be repurposed as tombs, convenient pre-existing structures that solved the burial problem in a city where the water table was now high because the ground level had risen. I went to New Orleans specifically to see this with my own eyes, to walk the French Quarter, to stand at Fort Pike, to visit the cemeteries. And once you know what to look for, the evidence is everywhere. The buildings are too heavy for the soil, but they stand because they're anchored to something deeper, something from before. The ironwork is too systematic, too geometric, too universal to be decoration. It's technology we no longer understand. The canal system is too sophisticated for 1700s colonial engineering. It's a remnant of advanced hydraulic civilization. The star forts are too perfect, too precisely geometric, too well preserved to be recent. Military construction in marsh. They're survivors from earlier. And the city sits below sea level, not because it gradually sank over 300 years, but because it was already sunken when the colonists arrived. They occupied the high ground, the tops of structures, the parts that remained above the water and mud, and they've been maintaining those remnants ever since, never admitting that they didn't build any of it. New Orleans is America's Atlantis, not hypothetical, not mythological, physical, real, present. A Tartarian water city that partially sank and was then occupied and claimed by people who found it. The evidence hasn't been destroyed because most people don't know what they're looking at. The iron lace is just decorative to tourists. The cemeteries are just quirky local customs. The below sea level geography is just unfortunate colonial planning. Fort Pike is just an old military fort. The canals are just drainage. But if you understand the pattern, if you've seen this same story repeat in cities across the world, New Orleans becomes obvious. It's not French colonial architecture. It's Tartarian water city architecture. Occupied, modified, maintained, and credited to people who found it, not built it. The implications of this are staggering. If New Orleans is a sunken Tartarian city, then the entire narrative of American colonization changes. The colonists weren't building civilization in empty wilderness. They were occupying the ruins of a more advanced civilization, finding cities that were already there, moving into structures they couldn't replicate, using technology they didn't understand, and claiming it all as their own achievement. This explains so much that official history struggles with. Why colonial cities showed sophisticated engineering immediately. Why heavy stone construction appeared in places with impossible soil conditions. Why canal systems and water management appeared in frontier cities that supposedly barely had basic infrastructure. They didn't create it. They found it. They occupied the surviving high ground of sunken cities. They maintained systems that were already in place. And they wrote a history that credited themselves with building what they had only found and claimed. New Orleans proves this more clearly than most cities because the geography is so impossible. No one would voluntarily build a stone city in a below sea level swamp. But if the city was already there, if it had sunk and you were occupying what remained above the mud line, then everything makes sense. The heavy buildings stand because they're anchored to deep foundations from before. The canals work because they're using a system designed by hydraulic engineers who understood water cities. The iron lace covers everything because it was part of an atmospheric energy collection network. Fort Pike sits in the marsh because it was part of the original city's infrastructure. And the tombs look like miniature houses because they are houses. Or rather, they're the rooftops of houses that are now buried. Walk through New Orleans with this understanding and the city transforms. You're not seeing French Quarter charm. You're seeing the visible remnants of a sunken Tartarian civilization. Every iron balcony is a clue. Every heavy stone building that shouldn't be standing is evidence. Every canal is a remnant. Every star fort is a survivor. And the water that constantly threatens the city, that's not a problem to be solved with pumps and levees. That's the city trying to return to its original state. New Orleans was designed to exist with water, to work with it, to use it. The modern city fights the water constantly because we don't understand the original design. We're trying to keep dry what was meant to be wet. The French didn't build New Orleans in a swamp. They found a water city that had sunk. They occupied the high ground. They maintained what they could. They destroyed what they couldn't explain. And they wrote a history that made them the builders of what they had only found. New Orleans is proof. Physical, present, walkable proof. That advanced civilization existed in America before European colonization. That Tartarian water cities were real. That the mud flood happened. That everything we're taught about the timeline of American development is wrong. The city is below sea level because it sank. The iron lace is technology. The canals are ancient infrastructure. Fort Pike is a Tartarian star fort. The World's Fair demolished Tartarian structures. And the cities of the dead are the rooftops of the buried city below. America's Atlantis isn't lost. It's in Louisiana. And you can visit it. You can walk on top of it. You can see the evidence with your own eyes. You just have to know what you're looking at. And once you see it, once you understand that New Orleans wasn't built but found, you can never see the city the same way again. The charm becomes tragedy. The quaintness becomes evidence. And the entire narrative of American history begins to crumble. Because if New Orleans was already there, what else was already there? What other cities are we walking on top of? What other advanced infrastructure are we maintaining without understanding? What other achievements are credited to the wrong civilization? The French Quarter isn't French, it's Tartarian. And the colonists who claimed to build it were occupiers, not builders. New Orleans remembers. The iron lace remembers. The canals remember. Fort Pike remembers. The cities of the dead remember, even if we've forgotten. But the evidence remains, sinking, submerged, surviving, testifying to a truth that official history desperately wants to keep buried beneath the mud. New Orleans wasn't built in a swamp. It was already there. And that changes everything.